Thank you for joining me for session 3 of Lifeway Explore the Bible, the study of Isaiah. Our text is Isaiah chapter 7, verses 7 through 17. The title is God Promises. There's a good suggestion on how to introduce your lesson in the Leader's Guide. There's also another good suggestion in Go Explore the Bible. Here's a third idea in terms of introducing the lesson. What would be the typical response of a person who discovers he's going to be audited by the IRS? That may create some interesting discussion. And then you could follow that up with a question. What do you suppose would be the response if the owner of a very powerful law firm promised that he would defend you in your case with the IRS? What would be a person's response? Now, Christians face many fears in a world filled with uncertainty. Broken families, disease, economic uncertainty, natural disasters are just a few of those. The crucial issue every believer who endures a great trial has to face is, will you trust God with your pain and your fear, or will you turn away from Him? And so the question is, why would you trust God? And our lesson is giving us one of those answers. Since God is sovereign, His people can trust His promises. And our lesson is about unpacking that truth to help us build our faith and our trust in God. Isaiah confronts Ahaz about his trust in God for his own life and for the nation of Judah. And we learn from his failure to trust God. You might ask the class if they could give you some of the context of what's happening. And hopefully that will begin to encourage the students to read their lessons before they come to Sunday school. You can fill in details as they begin to explain. But there's a bigger context that's happening that has an impact on this lesson. In chapter 7 to chapter 39, the unit is about trust. That's the theme that ties all those together. And what you see here is a contrast between either trusting the nations or trusting God. If Israel or Judah trusts the nations, then the outcome is destruction, chapter 34. But if the people will trust God, the outcome is going to be abundance, chapter 35. And chapter 7 to 12 is a historical introduction about the story of Ahaz and Assyria and his trust in them and the destruction that's going to happen. And God uses Assyria as a tool of judgment upon the nation of Judah as well as Israel. And it sets it up for the greater judgment that's going to come a century later with the Babylonians when they're taken off into captivity. But that sets up an even bigger opportunity to display the trustworthiness of God when He restores them back to the land from captivity. Now the whole issue seems to be, if Israel's going to be the servant nation through whom God is going to manifest Himself to the world, then the basic truth is this nation must learn to trust God and not trust the nations. So this is a lesson that really sets the tone for what you see in the rest of Isaiah chapter 7 through 39. The first point of our lesson is God intervenes, chapter 7, verses 7 through 9. Since God is sovereign, His people can trust His promises. The previous verses of chapter 7 were the plans of men. Now we begin to hear the plans of God. And when God speaks, God reveals Himself as great. And you can see this as you read through this. And so I'm going to ask the class if they would read through this. And where is it that God is asserting that He's in charge? He is great. And some of the things I'm going to point out from things that they may say as well is in verse 7. Notice it says, God says. So the one addressing them is not Isaiah. Isaiah's voice is being used, but it is God speaking through Isaiah. And these verses that follow in verse 7, this verse that it's really just 4 words. It's very, literally it says, not happen and not occur. It's bold, it's emphatic, it's strong, it's asserting this is not going to happen. And then he makes this contrast between this God of the universe, who is sovereign over the universe, and the kings of these nations. Imagine how insignificant these kings are in comparison to the God of the universe. He mentions the head of each nation. There's Rezin, and his capital is Damascus, and he's talking about Syria. And then there's Ephraim, which is, and Samaria is the capital of Ephraim, the northern kingdom. And the son, he doesn't even mention Pekah's name. He refers to him as the son of Remaliah. And then he gives this statement about 65 years. And what happened 65 years later is a king in Assyria by the name of Esarhaddon. The Assyrians had deported Israelites out of the northern kingdom and scattered them across the world. But then 65 years later, what that king did, Esarhaddon, is he brought people into the land, and in effect, he destroyed the possibility of the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, of ever having power, ever having a national identity. They were just completely gone. And the point he's making here is he's making this contrast between nations that are so insignificant and are going to be doomed, and here is the God of the universe. When crisis hits, what is it that we want? What was it that Ahaz wanted? For this is a terrific crisis that has come into his life. So what is it we want when crisis happens? The answers that I'm looking for is we want security, we want control, we want provision. So what does God want from us when a crisis enters our life? Well, you can see from the context of this story that what God wants from us is for us to trust Him. And why does He deserve our trust? He is sovereign. Despite how things may appear, we have a God who's eternal. He's not bound by time. He's not finite and time bound like we are. He's not a sin-filled creature like we are. He is sovereign over all, and we can trust Him even during times of crisis. So there's God's intervention, verses 7 through 9. Second point is God expects, chapter 7, verses 10 through 13. Apparently there's no response from Ahaz, and verse 10 begins, "Then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz." And he says to Ahaz, "Ask for a sign." He does this to encourage Ahaz's faith. And he also says, "Ask for a sign from the Lord your God." Now this is the God of the people of Judah. This is the God of Ahaz. And God has done these kinds of things in times past to strengthen the faith of people. For example, what was the sign that He gave Noah? What were the signs that He gave Moses? What were the signs that He gave Joshua? Can you think of other biblical heroes that God gave them signs in order to strengthen their faith? This is not a too terribly unusual offer of God, but God is doing this to strengthen Ahaz's faith. He will do anything, he says, to strengthen Ahaz's faith. Notice it can be as deep as the grave, and it can be as high as the heavens. There's no limit to what I will do for you, Ahaz, if you would just ask. I will do it to strengthen your faith. Now, God doesn't do this often. He doesn't want us to depend on physical signs. He wants us to depend on Him. And we're to recognize His work in the past, and we're to recognize His work and guidance in our lives today. But if God were to say to you, out of this pandemic, I am going to bring a great revival, like great revivals of the past that changed the culture of America. I am going to do this. And I want you to work for that. I want you to pray for that. If He were to say, just to encourage your faith, ask for a sign as deep as the grave, as high as the heavens, what would be some ideas that you might have that if God would do this, I would know for certain that God's bringing spiritual revival. Whatever might happen in the rest of this year, however bad it gets, I know what God's going to do is bring spiritual revival. What might be a sign that would encourage you to hold on to God's promise? That might be a fun discussion. I had an experience in church in recent times, and it was an issue that was perplexing to me and troubling to me. I didn't know how to handle it in a way that would be peaceful and productive. I prayed about it. I didn't act upon it because I wasn't certain about it. And then God just took care of it. It was wonderful. It worked out better than anything I could have ever thought of or any conclusion that I could have brought it to. And when I saw that and experienced that, it spoke to me about other matters that I'm concerned about and I'm praying about. Even bigger matters about how's this going to be completed? How is this going to be provided for? And when this event happened in my life, it was one of the ways that God said, you see, I can handle these things. You just trust me. Just be patient. Do what I ask you to do when I ask you to do it. And you can trust my promises I've made to you. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience of God building trust in my life. Now, since God is sovereign, His people can trust His promises. And I just want you to know, there are people in your Sunday school class, you know who they are, and they're facing some great, fearful things. And this is a truth that you just simply want to pray that you can work into their heart, that God would use you to work this in their heart, because it will bring them wonderful peace. Since God is sovereign, His people can trust His promises. A third point is God announces, verses 14 through 15. Ahaz won't give a sign. He feigns humility. But this statement where it says, ask for a sign, that's not an invitation. That's stated in the way of a command. And to resist a command is not an act of humility. It is an act of unbelief and disobedience. And that's what Ahaz is doing here. And so since he won't ask for a sign, God gives him a sign. And God speaks about a virgin birth and a child being born and his name being Emmanuel. What you see in these verses is not an emphasis upon the woman. The emphasis is upon the child. There's a child that's going to be born in the days of Isaiah and the day of Ahaz. They're going to know who this child is. That's something that's not given very much clarity in this. We don't know who the child is. There's lots of suggestions about who that might have been in Ahaz and Isaiah's day, but though we don't know, they knew. And every time Ahaz was aware of that child was a rebuke to his lack of trust in God. I can just imagine that he heard the mother call that child Emmanuel, God is with us. And Ahaz was reminded, yes, God has told me, He's with me, I can trust Him. And it also has a farther application as well, a future application. On Sesame Street, Grover wants to teach children about the concepts of near and far. He gets close to the camera and he says near. And then he gets a great distance from the camera and he yells distance. Well, that is in a sense what many of the prophecies of the Old Testament are about. They have a near fulfillment, and many times they have a far or a distant, ultimate fulfillment. And of course, you see this in this passage. This is what Matthew did when he quotes this passage in Matthew chapter 21. Now, the word that's used here for virgin is a Hebrew word that means a young woman of marriageable age. It's used 9 times in the Old Testament. Now, the Hebrew does have a word for virgin, but that's not what Isaiah uses. He uses the idea of a young woman of marriageable age. But you have to understand, in a Hebrew mindset, they would never have considered that she was a young woman of marriageable age who was having sex with men. That would not have computed with them. They would have just assumed and understood that this meant that she was a virgin. And the reason we can make that safe assumption is 200 years before Jesus, the Hebrew scholars translated the Hebrew text into Greek, and it's called the Septuagint. When those Hebrew scholars came to this passage, there is a specific word in the Greek language for virgin. And they translated this passage, the virgin will conceive. They used the specific word virgin. So when Matthew quotes this passage 200 years later, he's quoting it from the Septuagint. He wrote his gospel in Greek. So 200 years before the person of Jesus, the rabbis already had this understanding of a messianic figure coming, and there was going to be this unusual conception of this being. There was going to be a virgin birth. So the rabbis had that kind of a belief 200 years at least before the Christians made that clear that it was Jesus they were talking about. So Isaiah was speaking of a time in his day to Ahaz, but he was speaking more than he really understood, and that was in the future this would be fulfilled in Jesus. And so I have a question for you. In fact, the great example of this whole lesson summary statement, since God is sovereign, his people can trust his promises. The great illustration of that is Jesus. So how does the birth, the life, the death, the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus encourage you to trust God? What is it about those things that you see as God demonstrating his sovereignty? And then I might ask, as we wrap that up, do you have signs in your life that remind you to trust God? I mentioned one earlier, but you may have one as well. And then last of all, since God is sovereign, his people can trust his promises. And the fourth point is God judges, verses 16 through 17. Whatever we put in the place of trusting God turns on us to destroy. And then I'm just going to walk through these verses, giving some explanation as we close out the lesson. For before the boy knows to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the 2 kings you dread will be abandoned. Now that could be as much as 2 years to 12 years. But in a couple of years, Assyria destroys Syria and Ephraim, or the northern kingdom. Now, when I said 12 years, in Jewish life, a boy was considered a child till he was 12 years old. Then he had his bar mitzvah, and he stepped into adulthood. And he was expected at that time to know the difference between right and wrong. At 13, a Jewish girl had her bat mitzvah, and she stepped from childhood into womanhood. And she was expected to know the difference between right and wrong. But in short order, before this child knew the difference between right and wrong, those 2 nations would be destroyed. Verse 17, the Lord will bring on you your people and your father's house such a time as has never been seen since Ephraim separated from Judah. Imagine how fearful that would be. What if God said to America, what you're facing in the next few years, the only thing in your nation's history that I could compare it to as its severity is when you, as Americans, went through the Civil War in the middle 1800s. Can you imagine how frightening that would be? And this is what God says to Ahaz because of his lack of trust in God. And then he closes, he will bring the king of Assyria. This is going to be your great destruction. God judges. I have a picture of an elephant that I took from a children's coloring book. You might, if you decide to use this, you might want to have a better picture, but I'm just simply going to give them all a copy of this elephant from this children's coloring book and just say, what are elephants known for? And they're known for tricks and circuses. They're known for being the largest mammal on earth. They're known for being the king of the jungle, and they're known for their memory. And I'm going to say there's a story that's told about an elephant. The story is there were 3 blind men, and they were feeling of an elephant. One was feeling his trunk, and he said, it's a snake. Another was feeling of an elephant's leg, and he said, no, it's a tree. Another was feeling of the elephant's side, and he said, no, it's a wall. And people tell this story to say that none of us have the whole truth, and it's particularly applied to religions, and that we're arrogant to saying that we have the exclusive truth. But there's something about the story that people forget. The person who's telling the story, the narrator. The narrator sees the whole picture. The narrator knows it's an elephant. And what I want you to remember is the one who's addressing Ahaz sees the whole picture. He's sovereign of the universe. In one swoop, he sees the beginning and the end of time. He knows everything that's happening. We are so bound by time and sin. And yet the one that we've put our trust in, he sees it all. Which simply means we may experience something that is bad. It's a health crisis. It's an economic crisis. It's a family crisis. But the one that we've put our trust in, he sees the beginning of that and the end of that. And he's the one that says, you can trust me to keep my promises, even in the midst of that. And what would be some of God's promises when we're facing those kinds of crises? He's promised to always be with us. He's promised never to abandon us. He's promised that he can work in that in such a way that he can actually bring something good out of that into our lives. He promises that nothing will separate us from the love of God. This is our sovereign God. And since he's sovereign, his people can trust his promises. And if you have any questions about that, the ultimate example of God's sovereignty and him keeping his promises is Jesus Christ. Your members, boy, how they need this lesson. And maybe even more so in this day and time for some of them than any other time in their life. So I want you to know I'm praying for you that you're successful in helping them to understand, to grab hold and hang on and trust this good, loving, sovereign God. Thank you so much for teaching God's people God's word. God bless you.